their health needs met. Thank you.
Honourable Ms Vincent. Honourable Vincent.
Thank you, Mr Acting President. To sum up, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of my parliamentary colleagues, the Honourable Mr Hanson, the Honourable Mr Franks, of course, and the Honourable Mr Wade, and of course, as others have done, acknowledge the presence of Judy Burke, the wife of the late Bob, and also other members of Sanctuary Support Group and friends as well in the Chamber. Thank you for honouring us, not just with your ongoing advocacy, but also with your presence here today. I would like to pick up on a few comments that have been made by my colleagues, and also just to reiterate, I suppose, the very genuine intent with which many of those comments have been made. Of course, we are today not just honouring, but unfortunately remembering the late Bob Burke, who was a winner of the Dr. Margaret Tobin Award for his work, together with his wife Judy, in establishing and running for many years, since 2012 until the time of his death, Sanctuary Support Group, a support group for carers, friends and family of people with a borderline personality disorder diagnosis. I first wanted to touch on one particular comment from the Honourable Mr Hanson, in which he stated that as many as 80% of people with a BPD diagnosis have experienced trauma in their lifetime. While of course I do acknowledge that trauma can be a common factor in the development of BPD, I think it is important to acknowledge that that particular statistic is somewhat debated, and that I think it's important to acknowledge that BPD does not always result from trauma, and neither does trauma always result in BPD. It is a far more nuanced and complex issue than that, and I understand, or at least I don't believe, that there was any malice from the Honourable Mr Hanson in making that statement. I do want to acknowledge that that statistic is somewhat up for debate, but other than that, thank him for his contribution. The Honourable Ms Franks, of course, reminds us that BPD is often regarded as the Cinderella of mental illnesses, and often, unfortunately, not for glamorous reasons. It's not as glamorous as it might sound, because of course Cinderella was often always the bridesmaid, never the bride, if you like, when it came to Disney princesses. She was often shunned, hidden away, told not to seek help or seek support or to go out into the community, and that is often there are often many parallels with the common experiences of people with BPD. There are still those within the medical profession who deny the existence of borderline personality disorder as a mental health issue in its own right. There are those who see those as BPD as simply being attention-seeking, or perhaps reaching out because of trauma that they have experienced, as the Honourable Mr Hanson touched on, again with the best of intent. But at the end of the day, no matter what the reason that somebody is in pain, no matter what the reason that somebody is reaching out for help, it is up to us to acknowledge that experience and acknowledge that need and provide that support and that help. So I am pleased to see that I think that is gradually changing, not as quickly as any of us in this chamber here today would like, I am sure, but we certainly have a long way to go. And of course, the Honourable Ms Franks also reminds us that as much as there is room for improvement, there is already a cure, namely and most commonly dialectical behaviour therapy, or DBT. Now, DBT is an interesting form of therapy for many reasons, not least of which is the fact that it was developed by a woman called Marsha Linehan. I've never been 100% sure of how to pronounce that name, and I haven't yet had the pleasure of meeting her, so she hasn't yet been able to correct me. But through my readings, I've come to understand that Dr. Linehan herself, if not diagnosed with BPD, at least experienced something very similar herself. And I think that goes to the Honourable Mr Wade's point about the authority of lived experience, and how it's often the lived experience that can lead to the most effective treatments and therapies, because it's actually being developed by people who understand deeply what it is to go through this and what does and doesn't work. And often in this place I'm talking whether it be for people with disabilities or people with mental health challenges or elderly people or people from other minorities or with other challenges. I often state in this place that people need to be recognised and respected as the experts in their own lives, and none is more true than in the case of effective treatment for a host of mental health issues, not just PPD but others as well. And that's why it is fantastic that we are seeing a gradual increase in the use of things like peer mentoring and peer networking in the mental health community, and long may that continue, but we have a long way to go, which leads me nicely to the next steps, if you like, which is of course that the Labor government has finally joined myself and my parliamentary colleagues from the Greens and the Liberal opposition in committing funding to a borderline personality disorder centre of excellence here in South Australia, a spoken hub specific model, which the Honourable Ms Franks touched on the importance of, for the treatment of people with borderline personality disorder. Now, it is incredibly frustrating that it is only after 6 or 7 years of lobbying that we have finally got to this point and got the government to see not just the cents but also the dollars and cents in terms of it's an old one but it works well, the money that stands to be saved from getting people well again, from getting them back into employment, from getting them back into community, back into family life, not presenting repeatedly to hospital and to emergency departments, which alone are incredibly expensive. Even a one-off event presenting to an emergency department is incredibly expensive. So when you have repeat presenters, the bills certainly do add up. Now, I don't say that to make people who might be listening to this presentation who are themselves diagnosed with BPD to feel any sense of guilt about racking up that bill, because absolutely I understand that the only reason that they need to do that is because the current effective therapies are not readily enough available, and so I don't want anyone listening to this speech to feel guilty for that, but I think it just goes to show how poor a recognition and response to borderline personality disorder in this state has been, that people feel they have no other choice often but to report that they are at imminent risk of self-harm and present to hospital, or even worse and even more tragically go through with self-harm in order to feel able to present to hospital. Now, it is hard to put into words exactly what kind of a place you have to be in to take that course of action, and exactly how terrible it feels when you are so far down in that deep place of darkness and emptiness and despair that you feel that is the only course of action available to you, to then turn to have family members or friends or even worse, health professionals turn to you and say that your experiences aren't valid and that you're just attention seeking and that you should be able to control these urges or these experiences, is just to say it's kicking people when they're down is, I think, insultingly simplistic, but I struggle to think of another analogy. But as my colleagues have reminded us, as we have together done many times in this place, there is a cure, and that can only be available, though, with effective, holistic investment from all levels of government, all parties, and wherever necessary, to ensure that that is readily available, to ensure that people no longer feel the need to go through with those desperate courses of action to seek out the appropriate support. As colleagues have already reminded us, as many as 10% of people with a BPD diagnosis will end their lives by suicide. And often, I don't know the exact statistics, but from my experiences, both personal and working with constituents, I dare to say that often that's not even intentional suicide. Now, that's not to say that that makes it any better or any worse, but that is to say that there are people who are crying out for help, who feel that their only option is to go through with these drastic measures, who often, as is the case with many people who are considering suicide, don't actually want to die, they just want the pain to die. But they can't see any other way currently without effective treatment than to take these drastic measures that no person should ever be in a position to have to even consider, let alone carry through. So if nothing else today, other colleagues have labelled themselves eternal cynics, others have labelled themselves eternal optimists. I might go as far as to label myself a chronic optimistic cynic. A chronic cynicism. I can't even say words. You understand what I'm trying to say? Hands up, please fix that for me. But we do know that the government has finally publicly come to the fore and agreed to commit funding to this important project over the next few years to finally catch up with what other states like Victoria and New South Wales through Project AIR and also Spectrum have had in place for many years and have had great success with. Of course, implementation is the next challenge, and the devil will always be in the detail. But we do have a meeting between myself and also representatives from the Office of Treasury and SA Health, as well as many of the good people behind me this evening, to ensure that we do get the ball rolling in making sure that this project does get underway absolutely as soon as possible, so that we don't lose any more people to this horrific, unnecessarily, I might add, horrific illness. I'm very much looking forward to that work. I thank those behind me who have put up their hand to be a part of those ongoing discussions, because, again, I think that goes back to the importance of lived experience being the only way to achieve effective holistic results. But if nothing else, Mr. Acting President, I think the last thing I need to do today is, of course, once again place on the record my thanks to Bob for his ongoing work. I only wish he was here to see what is happening now and what will happen since. My thanks to Judy and other members of Sanctuary for carrying on in some very, very difficult times, not least of which was the loss of dear Bob. Also to remember those constituents, family members, friends who have already lost their lives to this terrible experience, and to perhaps most importantly, to say to those who are still waiting that there may well be people out there who don't believe that what you're going through is genuine, and don't believe that what you are going through is worth investing in. But I hope that what has been said in this chamber here today, and indeed before, and hopefully long beyond, shows you that there are many, many more who do and will continue to fight for you. So please, know that you are worth it, know that we are fighting for you, and hold on. Thank you.
Put the question. Those for the question say aye. Against.